Today we're going to begin our look at the four presidents of the 1960s through 1980s, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan. Nixon was a Republican, Ford was a Republican, Carter was a Democrat, and Reagan was a Republican. So we already looked at Nixon a little bit in terms of Vietnam. He was elected in '68 with the promise to end the war. And if you remember, he called this peace with honor. This idea appealed to a majority of voters. They called themselves the silent majority. They thought the protest movements of the 1960s, both for Vietnam and civil rights, were radical and un-American. And as we're going to see in the map on the next slide, Nixon wooed the South. This is where we begin to see the South turn more conservative and start to support the Republicans, where it had been a Democratic stronghold since after the Civil War. Winning states like South Carolina was important. The president-elect promised to hold the line on civil rights and desegregation because we had seen those become important topics under JFK and LBJ. The Deep South in the map, as we'll see, went to Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, who was a strong supporter of states' rights and honoring racial segregation. Here's a picture of the map, and as you can see down here, the Deep South went to this third party. As we said, Nixon appealed to this silent majority by promising to restore law and order. If you remember from 10th grade, there was a balance between the federal and state laws, and anything involving multiple states falls under federal jurisdiction. So as you can see in this photo, this is a bus protest that we'll look at when we study civil rights. And the federal government went after arresting people in protests that had crossed state lines. These rides were called freedom rides, and many people thought this was sort of a destruction of their way in life. So this tough on crime idea pleased the South and served as a counterpoint or a backlash to the civil rights movement. Under President Nixon, he promised his program called the New Federalism, and it would shrink the power of the federal government that we had seen grow under President Johnson. If you remember the Great Society, LBJ had created many programs to help the poor, and Nixon tried to decentralize the federal government and share more power with state and local governments. He said there would be more federal funds if they complied. So in particular, this really appealed to the South, who still had that strong sense of individualism that we still see today. Nixon was not well liked by senators or congresspeople, and he didn't have many political allies. So he tried to get his ideas into place by impounding funds, taking away the funds for them to use as they saw fit. And the Supreme Court ultimately ruled this was a not acceptable use of executive power. So after becoming president, he tried to roll back some of the reforms that we had seen in place under LBJ. In particular, some people felt that poor people were giving money for nothing, and this reduced the incentive for them to work. And we saw when you did that homework assignment on the two views of the Great Society. One of the programs was AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and Nixon wanted to lower the amount families got and increase their need to work. In theory, this is a great idea. Why give people something for nothing? And here's the question: would you rather stay home and collect unemployment benefits or go get a job? We're going to talk in our Zoom meeting on Thursday as to why this is not as easy as it might seem. One of the things, besides his resignation in Watergate, that Nixon was most known for, and today is given a lot of credit for, is his foreign policy. His Secretary of State, a very experienced man by the name of Henry Kissinger, who had served under both JFK and LBJ and was respected by both parties, was a Jewish refugee from World War II, very bright man, Harvard graduate, and he became central to Nixon's international image and achievements. Nixon is responsible for this policy known as détente, which is a cooling off of the fires that burned during the Cold War. As we know, basically it was the USSR versus the US, and Nixon and Kissinger supported easing these tensions with the goal of avoiding nuclear war. They're still ideological rivals, but we want to thaw and ease these tensions a little bit. The U.S. would negotiate with China and USSR, keeping the idea of containment on the back burner. But that didn't become our focus goal anymore of stopping spreading of communism. The greater goal was to avoid nuclear war. Now here we run into a problem. We saw during Vietnam that Kissinger was secretly meeting with North Vietnam, and the same thing happened with better results in 1972. He secretly met with China, and this is the first interaction we have with China since the Communist Revolution in 1949. I told you in class how when I was growing up we had Red China, which was the communist big country of China, and then Taiwan, which was the good China. And they used to have separate Olympic teams and separate flags and everything. So Nixon actually traveled to China, which was the first time any American president had done this, I think, forever. And by kind of going in the back door with China, it was hoped that the USSR and the United States would eventually meet. We eventually have the first nuclear arms treaty, SALT I, which stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which was to, again, put that thaw in the building up of weapons, increase trade, and share science. And for a while, Nixon's foreign policy made him widely popular. This was seen as a major international coup, and he was the first president since World War II to visit the USSR and contribute to the first thaw in the Cold War. So internationally, foreign policy-wise, things were going great for President Nixon. But as we approached the election of 1972 for his second term, things began to fall apart. Here's a picture of Nixon signing SALT I, the first treaty with Soviet leader Nikita Brezhnev that most Americans could not have believed that this day had come. So I'm going to stop here, and you're going to focus on the first part of Nixon. And the thing that he's most famous for, of course, is Watergate, and there's an assignment to do that. Later in the week, I'll come back with a screencast on Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan.